My name is Alberta Whittle. I think I've always made art since I was a child. I always found myself making things, either collecting different objects, picking up snails in the garden, making a lot of different sets almost. In the garden, I found myself with my dolls just creating different scenes. I did my foundation year in Birmingham, where I lived with my family after I left Barbados. And then from Birmingham, I went to Edinburgh College of Art. And I stayed in Edinburgh for quite a while afterwards. And then I felt as though I needed to take a change of direction. And so I travelled to Glasgow to do my MFA and found myself staying on. So I find myself making lots of different things, similar to when I was a child making these scenes. I do performances, I make collages. I'd say I really am quite obsessed with making collages, and this practice of piecing together different images, different texts is something which follows through in all of my work. So whether that's making a film, I often find myself sourcing different materials. Sometimes I'll use different objects I've made, different sculptural objects I've made as props, and they then find their way into my films. I work with a range of people. I've tended to, the last couple of films, work with the same people because so much of my research is looking at community, looking at family, because I live away from my family, most of whom live in Barbados, apart from a few in Birmingham. I've been thinking so much about these really quite difficult subjects, such as climate colonialism, what does it mean to live in the afterlife of slavery, how we consider the inequalities that affect so many of us. And really, in thinking through these ideas, it feels as though the only ethical way to do that is through opening up these subjects through networks of friends and people who've become like family to me in my work. I feel as though there needs to be a space created to explore these ideas, but they can't be seen necessarily as always individualized, that we have to think about these issues of inequality within a broader context and understand how they relate to everyone. So the title for the exhibition, How Flexible Can We Make the Mouth, refers to my own difficulties with breath. And throughout a lot of the different works I've been looking at for this exhibition, they're around humanity and actually what it means to be alive today, what it means to live through certain points of difficulty. So I do a lot of writing behind my work. There's always certain texts or scripts I'm working on, and sometimes they're finished and sometimes they're not. This particular exhibition has involved a lot more text than how I normally work. And when I write my text, the punctuation is really important, because when I write my text, they're not meant really just to be read in the head, they're meant to be read aloud. And so when I punctuate, because I want people to remember to breathe, and often when I read poetry, I read other people's writing, it's hard to think of where the breath should be. And so it can become a bit of a panting exercise to get to the end of the line. And the comma is always about the breath. So there are always these over punctuations in my work with the comma. And also there's this, because so many of the issues I'm looking at are around this, the lack of humanity that's granted to certain people, especially if I think about the lack of humanity that's granted to queer people, to black people, to migrants, to asylum seekers, to people living in the precarity of geography. There's this feeling that we're all holding our breath, especially in connection with what's going on now with the weather. Because when I've been thinking about making this film, making the two film works that are in the main gallery space and then in one of the ancillary rooms, between a whisper and a cry and from the forest to the concrete to the forest, they're really reflecting on these geographies which are always so vulnerable, even though they actually are not really responsible for the many issues related to climate catastrophe that are going on around the world. And it's about the ambivalence that can really be in place from the West to consider their own complicity or their own processes of destruction which were affecting the planet, but because they're not necessarily, the West is not really in the front line in the same way. So with the title of From the Forest to the Concrete to the Forest, within the credits, the date is very important because it was, the editing for it was pretty much finished on 9/9/19, which is 9 days after the tropical depression, which became the hurricane, which affected the Bahamas and the Abaco Islands. It hit. And in the duration of that time, the way in which that catastrophe, that disaster is being visualized has really, it's affected me so deeply. I've just been in tears looking at that footage. And then when I look at the news that's going on in the UK, instead of there really being much time dedicated to the fact that people are dying and people are living in such disastrous conditions, there's a really bright headline yesterday saying it's going to be sunny next week. We're going to have this wonderful period of sunshine in the UK. And that's the focus. So where is the understanding of the relationship between the circumstances that the West has put in place from slavery, from colonialism, from the Industrial Revolution, which have now created these conditions which are now furthering climate catastrophe and are essentially leading to the destruction of the planet? Since being in Dundee in the preparation for this show, I've been spending a lot of time in the print studio with all of the wonderful staff there, and it's been a really important process actually in preparing for the exhibition because it's allowed me to reflect on certain works which I knew were going to be in the exhibition with a bit of distance, but also to consider how news or images are, or histories are visualized. And one of the moments I wanted to reflect on was this encounter between Europe and the Americas, in particular looking at the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. And so I came across these prints by Thomas de Bry, who's an artist from the Netherlands. And I actually grew up knowing these images reasonably well because my father had a catalogue from an exhibition that was produced to create a counter-narrative of the celebration of Columbus's 500-year anniversary, which as a child I was really struck by the violence of these images, but also how they created a particular ideology based on civilized or uncivilized, and what those opposing presentations of histories and of people and of encounters really suggested, and what that kind of lays the groundwork for to justify colonialism, to justify inequalities, to justify all of these different circumstances of abuse and oppression which we're still encountering today. And so in reflecting on these images, it was really important to me to kind of bring them up to date. And so because the process of also making the wood blocks and then making the prints from the wood blocks was so important, I thought it would be really useful for the audience to actually see one of the wood blocks. And so the one I chose was an image of Columbus encountering an Indigenous woman while she's in a hammock. And one of the reasons for that is about thinking about the expectations of Indigenous people or of people of color as being lazy and being unproductive, which was why colonialism was a positive idea. And this is really a myth that has been clung to in these narratives of colonialism, as though it was somehow good for Indigenous people to bring supposed civilization. I wanted this figure to be at rest. And I wanted that to be very clear that she was at rest and she was being startled by Columbus, who's coming with all of the supposed trappings of civilization, with his compass, with his flag, with all of that technology. Yeah, and so for me, these prints become an introduction into the larger ideas of contesting histories, of looking at history as a myth, and the conditions which are laid through these histories in connection with where we are today. You know, history in school is taught to be considered absolutely fact, and there is no questioning or querying of those histories, and there's no, whereas it's really for me a sleight of hand. It is as much a myth as local folklore at times, because the witnesses who are there are, they've got their own biases that are in place affecting what they narrate. In the large gallery, there's a very large installation that's been set up with a Barbadian chattel house that it's been built in such a way to look as though it's been submerged or it's subsiding into the floor. And, where my family live in Barbados, we're very lucky within the Caribbean because we're just slightly out of range of the hurricane path. So it's very rare for us to encounter that many tragedies. And one of the tragedies which I did grow up, I was around for, was when we lost a Barbadian Calypsonian called Carew. It was a very funny but also highly topical Calypsonian, and it was in the late 90s when a hurricane hit. Almost, it shaved the coast of Barbados on the west coast, and his house fell in. It basically it got almost washed away, and he died in the process of that. And so I wanted to speak of these particular moments of vulnerability where there's really very little infrastructure to support survival in these zones. I think so many conversations I had in the making of Between a Whisper and a Cry, which is the large projected film work, were around the hurricane season and my own anxiety and feelings of very complicated feelings of being in the West whilst I was making the film, but also being very aware of friends and loved ones, both in the Caribbean and in Miami and Florida, who were going through really terrible times preparing for these hurricanes, and then being in these moments where, okay, the hurricane's passed, we're now going to rebuild, but actually no, there's another hurricane following not that long afterwards. But yet there was this sense of ambivalence or an expectation that rebuilding would be easy, or that rebuilding would really be possible in a very quick turnaround. And that house for me becomes a memorial to the fact that it might never get rebuilt. I don't know where Carew's house is now. It might still be there in that state of debris. It's obviously will have kind of degraded more, but it's the fact that within these geographies, within the Caribbean, within the Southern America, there's always this state of rebuilding, but with very few resources. And one is always having to think very imaginatively about how to create a life, how to create a life in these precarious spaces. So the film's been split into 5 sections, and it responds to a poem which you find in the Anglophone Caribbean, which denotes each month as having a particular timing of the hurricane season. So it begins with June Too Soon, July Stand By, August Come It Must, September Remember, October All Over. And it's a poem I've known since childhood. I'm sure it was around since my mum was a child. But it really needs to be updated because now the hurricane season comes much earlier. You can have hurricanes coming as early as April, and it can go on till November. And each month is meant to suggest where we are in the season. So right now the exhibition opens in September, and we are deep. We are deep in the hurricane season. The line is September Remember. And I wanted the feeling of watching the film to be almost as though a wave has caught hold of you. So a wave has caught hold of you and you are being thrown up, and then you're also being buried underneath the waves, and you're gasping for air at different points. So it's a very choppy rhythm throughout the film. And it's also this feeling of breath where I've spoken about the punctuation is really important, because there are times when the breath is literally articulated as the sound of my own breath being part of the soundtrack. And that's meant to kind of almost remind you to keep on breathing, because you're now underwater. You're now underwater within this wave, within this soundtrack. And so there's a certain point in September where we're in a church, and this is a church of spiritual Baptists, which is a Caribbean diasporan religion. There are lots of influences from West Africa, but you find the religion in different points of the Caribbean. Mainly the Anglophone Caribbean, so St. Vincent, Barbados. You'll also find outposts in the US. The particular service which I recorded, Mount Pigby, they are actually residing in a credit union building in Barbados. And so there's a very ad hoc feeling within this church. It's not built for purpose. And so there are these chairs which are stackable plastic chairs. And I wanted to create an echo within the installation, which also kind of invited the audience members to be part of the experience. But rather than have the chairs just exist, I wanted there to be a feeling of thinking about being in the water, thinking about the histories of being in the water, and also the same legacies of these journeys from colonialism to the present day, where we're still experiencing the crisis of people being transported, often in very difficult circumstances, across the Mediterranean. So there are chains amidst the chair legs, and that's to also remind us of these histories, because the chains are now used as ballast. But actually, we now have this situation where people become ballast and they will be tossed overboard. And they were during colonial times, where people were just sent overboard because their value was more, they had more value when it was going to be an issue of an insurance claim. And so it's really meant to bring that back to where are we within how we understand our humanity, and the loss of humanity that's happening around the world with certain bodies. Certain bodies aren't allowed to be human. What does that mean when certain people literally do not have the right to live? Boats are arriving in the Bahamas to take people to Florida for safety, and suddenly at the last minute the information changes and people are being taken off these boats again, essentially to a situation where they could be encountering their death because of cholera, because of additional storms coming. The people in the Bahamas, their humanity is in danger. And what does that mean for us in the West? How can we reclaim our humanity? What can we do? You know, and when I think about making my work, it really depends on the urgency of what I'm thinking about. And when I was preparing for the exhibition, I wanted there to be a moment where after walking through Gallery 1 and looking at the prints, and also listening to my grandmother's story, which is part of that dividing of Gallery 1, and watching the film in the main gallery too, I wanted there to be this moment of reflection where the audience could rest, because I'm really aware that these are very difficult histories and ideas to sit with. But it just wasn't possible. It just really wasn't possible. And I started making a film and an installation which was going to create a zone of rest, almost to conclude things, in one of the smaller ancillary rooms. But when the news came of the situation in the Bahamas, it just wasn't possible. My own relationship to being in this very privileged position, living in the West very comfortably, it just felt really clear that this situation is ongoing. There's no way of putting a full stop. There is no full stop at the end of this.